Tonight we have one of our favorite people, Robert Hefner. Bob Hefner is the Director of Historic Services for the Village of East Hampton, but that barely touches the surface of who Bob is and what Bob does. He's written books about the windmills of Long Island, about East Hampton architecture. He's researched other books. He's done numerous historic structure reports on different buildings around the East End. He's a wonderful, wonderful resource for all things historic, and we think he's one of our real treasures in East Hampton, so please welcome Bob Hefner.
Thank you, Barbara. We'll turn the lights off. Okay. So the theme of the lecture series from land from sea. So when it comes to the land part, the 8,000 acres of pasture on Montauk was the most valuable, the most productive land in East Hampton. Because of Montauk, raising livestock was the basis of East Hampton's agrarian economy from the 60s through the end of the 19th century. What other town in the Northeast had 8,000 acres of pasture? What other town in the Northeast had 3 livestock keepers and built houses for them to live in? Can you hear me? Is this?
Yes.
Okay, good. This lecture describes the Montauk pastures, the duties of the keepers, and the 3 houses they lived in. The wild and open Montauk pasture land drew tourists and sportsmen, and the role the 3 houses played as inns for these visitors is the middle part of the talk. And the story will conclude with the end of the pasture system in 1895, when Frank Sherman Benson and Mary Benson, who inherited Montauk from their father, sold 5,000 acres to the Long Island Railroad. And that brought the end of the pasture system.
Yes.
We got to see if this was going to work. It does. So, on the top is the 1873 Beers Atlas. And the Montauk pastures begin here at First House when the land starts to rise off the Napeak stretch. Here's First House right here, in line with Fresh Pond. The sheep pasture was from First House to Fort Pond. Here's their plain, here's the woods, and here's Second House at Fort Pond. And then the cattle pastures were east of Fort Pond, and Third House is right here, south of Indian Field. And here's our aerial photograph today: Fresh Pond, Fort Pond, Great Pond, now Lake Montauk, since it's been opened up. Also very important to the Montauk pastures, as well as the land, was the ponds for the fresh water for the cattle. So we have Fresh Pond, Fort Pond, Great Pond, Big Reed Pond, Little Reed Pond, Oyster Pond, and the Money Ponds out at Montauk Point. The system of 3 keepers and 3 houses was in place early in the 18th century and continued until 1895. In summary, the keeper of First House was in charge of entering all the livestock who came onto the pasture. The keeper at Second House was in charge of the sheep, and the keeper at Third House was the herdsman of the cattle and the horses. This is the 1838 U.S. Coast Survey of Montauk, and we have First House here, Second House, Third House. And the practice of pasturing cattle on Montauk began in 1661, when a group of East Hampton farmers acquired title from the Montaukett Indians for land from Napeag to Fort Pond. And then title to all of Montauk was acquired by 1687. The Montaukett retained certain rights to the land and continued to live at Indian Field, which is east of Great Pond. All the farmers who put up money for the initial purchases and their descendants owned the pasture as tenants in common. The land was managed by the town trustees until 1852, when the proprietors of Montauk formally organized, elected their own board of trustees, and took over management of the pasture. Thankfully, we have some good photographs of the Montauk pasture that show us the beautiful landscape that now it is hard to imagine ever really existed. This is an album of photographs that dates from the 1880s. Other photographs in this cyanotype, that blue tint, were taken by someone at the Montauk Association, because there are a lot of, you've probably all seen the Montauk Association cottage pictures that have the blue color to them. So this view is from Indian Field looking west across Lake Montauk. It's hard to figure these out today. Rick Whalen, who's studied a lot of Montauk and walked all over it, helped me identify where these pastures were in this series of photographs. I'm using this photograph and another to follow as backdrops for some early descriptions of the Montauk pastures before we take a more detailed look at them. It's not surprising that one of the earliest references to the Montauk pasture would be during the Revolutionary War. On July 6, 1776, Connecticut Governor Jonathan Trumbull wrote to General George Washington, "I hear from Captain Niles that there are 4,000 head of neat cattle on Montauk Point. A great part of them good beef cattle fit for slaughter. Is it not best that you procure these at Montauk to prevent their being used to feed the enemy?" So 6 weeks later, Battle of Long Island, Washington was defeated. The British came in to occupy, and the Montauk herd did feed the occupying British Army and Navy. In 1798, John Lyon Gardner described East Hampton's resurgent economy following the war. And this, in 1798, this is really the best description of the Montauk pastures in the whole system. The people of East Hampton are more properly graziers than farmers. They raise large droves of cattle and sheep for sale and very little else. The droves of cattle and flocks of sheep are during the summer season pastured on Montauk, which contains about 8,000 acres of good land. This land is owned by a number of persons, and the pasturing of stock is according to the shares that individuals hold, and is under good regulations which are carried into effect by the 3 hired keepers of the stock. Besides a fatting field for 500 head of cattle, there are in this tract of land 1,400 sheep, 1,000 stock cattle, and about 200 horses. It is one of the largest tracts of pasture land in the United States. There are no flies to trouble the stock while grazing on the land. The use of this tract of land is a very great advantage to the inhabitants of East Hampton. So Gardner sums it all up: 8,000 acres of pasture, owned in shares, policy set by trustees, day-to-day operations by the 3 keepers. So Montauk was the first early livestock corporation in the Northeast. This photograph is the view from Prospect Hill in Indian Field, looking east to Oyster Pond. And you can see in this photograph, whether we can see it, but there is the Montauk Point Lighthouse right there. The following account of the Montauk pasture is from the 1874 book, Historical and Descriptive Sketches of Suffolk County. The peninsula of Montauk contains about 9,000 acres. The greater part of it is bare of timber and covered with a luxuriant growth of grass, affording excellent pasturage for stock, and to this purpose it is almost exclusively devoted. To the richness of its feeding, add the abundant supply of pure, wholesome water afforded by numerous springs and ponds, which are scattered over the surface, the cool and refreshing sea breeze, and the entire absence of annoying insects, and we find this spot particularly favored for the purpose to which it has been appropriated for more than 200 years. Now a more detailed look at the Montauk pasture system from west to east, beginning with the drive of livestock onto Montauk. Cattle were brought out to Montauk in early May and driven back in the middle of November. Sheep came out in March and returned in late November or early December. So this illustration is from an 1881 Lippocotts magazine article. This is Main Street, Amagansett, where the herd was corralled before going out and then upon their return. And you can see from the landmarks here the windmill on the north, Presbyterian Church, that these cattle are, in this case, are returning from Montauk. The magazine article describes the cattle drive. A score of well-mounted horsemen urged the herd of 12 to 1,400 cattle along over the hills and sandy ways. The herdsman's shouts resound cheerily. The dust rises, the earth shakes with the tread of the host. And now and then a restless steer breaks ranks and dashes away, pursued by the horseman. Or a mad bull creates a diversion by charging on a herdsman who has ventured too near. So this is the 1845 Coast Survey, and this is the route of the cattle drive, Main Street, Amagansett. 7 miles out to First House, right here. So down Atlantic, Old Montauk Highway, and then there was some speculation that they go along the beach or on a road. So there was a road inland right here. So this is where the route they would take. Out to First House was a big corral at First House Fort. So here's the destination. This is the fence at the beginning of the Montauk pasture. And this is First House right here, so just a little bit beyond First House. And this big corral is where the livestock could be contained before the drive or after the drive. And here we have another early coast survey showing First House and its environment. So here's First House. And the corral for the cattle on there, or sheep. And then there's a fence, this dotted line is the fence going down to Fresh Pond. And there's another fence from Fresh Pond to the bay at a location still known today as Water Fence. And this fence formed the boundary of the pastures. And on the aerial photograph, you're coming along Montauk Highway. Here's the split where Old Montauk Highway goes off to the right, and 27 goes up the hill. And you have the Hither Hill State Park campground and parking lot. So First House burned down in 1909, but the site of it is right here, right across from the parking lot. And this, of course, Fresh Pond and Water Fence. So this is First House, built in 1798 to replace an earlier house. During the Revolutionary War, East Hampton's herd was decimated, and the keepers' dwellings in Montauk were undoubtedly wrecked. Rebuilding after the war included new dwellings, a new second house in 1797, new first house 1798, and a new third house in 1806. And the timing of this considerable building enterprise with the purchase of the Montauk Lighthouse Reservation by the federal government is probably that money is probably what allowed the trustees to build these new houses starting the following year. Beginning about 1850, the houses were referred to in their order, west, east, first, second, third. Before that, what we now know as First House was Hither House, second house was House at Fort Pond, and third house was Further House. So now it's 1, 2, 3. The primary job of the keeper at First House was to maintain the fence at the boundary and to keep a list of all livestock coming through the gate, seeing that the cattle, horses, and sheep were in accordance with the rights of their owners. And here is the common pasture list actually kept at First House in 1820. And in this book, the keeper accounted for the cattle that came into the Montauk pasture through that gate or on the drive, and each animal was assigned to the pasture rights of a proprietor. And here's a page inside that book where we have the owners' names, the value of their share, and the number of cattle they brought onto the pasture. At the bottom of the page, we see John Lyon Gardner, who has a share valued at 60 pounds. And he brought in 86 cattle. And up there you'll see Miller Dayton, for instance, by comparison, 5-pound share, he has 7 cattle. And at First House and Third House, the keepers had a book of earmarks that would identify the cattle and sheep. There may have been brands also, but this illustration is from an 1871 Harper's Magazine article where the author visited First House and copied this from his book. So you see the nick, the slope, the L, the hole, the slit, the hollow, the U, and the halfpenny, and there probably were quite a few more. This is a view of about 1900, looking from the sheep pasture of Hither Plain to the west. And you can see First House, First House and the fence running along to water fence. And this would be the corral where the cattle could be kept. And then so today we have Hither Hill States Park right in here. The next dwelling was at Fort Pond, which was the division between the sheep pasture of Hither Plain and the cattle pastures east. And this, of course, is second house today. And here we have the 1838 Coast Survey. Here's second, Fort Pond, second house. On Shepherd's Neck, the keeper of second house had a big fenced field for his farm where he could raise crops. And you'll see at Fort Pond, which was the barrier, was extended by a ditch to the north toward the bay, and then there would have been a fence to close off completely the sheep and the cattle. And on the south side, there's a fence going from Fort Pond down to the beach. And here the aerial photograph for second house here. This little lagoon might be part of that little ditch that went out to the bay. And here's second house in the photograph of the 1870s. The center is George Osborne, keeper of second house from 1866 to 1886. To the right is the 1809 barn, it's still standing today. The keeper at second house was responsible for maintaining the barrier between the sheep pasture and the cattle pasture, and was in charge of the sheep. And he had to ride out 2 days every week to check on the sheep, and of course they also would round them up to bring them back and forth from Amagansett. And during the breeding season, they would be segregated. Then the Coast Survey showing the sheep pasture from the fence at First House to Fort Pond. And this was not as high quality pasture as was found east of Fort Pond. And the trustees worked to expand the pasture land into Hither Woods. Each year they would allot a certain area of Hither Woods for the keepers to clear cut for cordwood that they could sell. So that was a good system that gave the keepers a way to make some money, and then it cleared more land for pasture. Each year the sheep were came on to Montauk in early March. Then they went back to East Hampton in early June for shearing, and then they came back to Montauk. On May 24, 1852, the trustees agreed to have the sheep brought off for washing and shearing on Tuesday, the first day of June, and to allow them to go back on Friday the 4th. Also, that no sheep be allowed to go to the east of the first house on Montauk without being duly entered and listed on the proprietor's rights. Sheep were driven off Montauk in late November, early December. The town trustees at their meeting on November 22, 1813, appointed Jonathan Stratton and Isaac Barnes to go to Montauk and assist the keepers in bringing up the sheep the first snow that may hereafter come. This photograph is among a group taken in 1904 by the Olmsted Brothers landscape firm when they were planning a subdivision of Hither Woods, or Hither Plain. And when you first see these photographs, it's, my goodness, where is this? What is this? But, and here, of course, is what is now Old Montauk Highway. Here's another view of the roadway for the carts and the animals and the wide open plain of Hither Plain. You can almost had a sense of these shrubs waiting to take it over. The abandoned pasture, no more sheep. And that certainly is what happened. Another Olmsted photograph looks down Fort Pond toward the ocean. And you can actually see, so this is from probably Fort Hill. Here's second house right here. And you can see it very, very low between the pond and the ocean. And this photograph of second house, which was restored by Kevin McCann, who's been very generous with his collection of William Wallace Tucker photos. And I'm showing this is all part of the series leading up to something that, right here, there's no sand dune between the ocean and the land. And they had a problem of, in storms, the ocean washing over into Fort Pond and making the water brackish. And nothing was more important than maintaining the drinking water for the cattle and the sheep. So in 1822, the trustees decided to construct a stone wall between Fort Pond and the ocean to prevent the surf from flowing in and making it unsuitable for drinking. At their meeting on October 21, 1822, it was agreed the whole board go to Montauk on Friday the 25th and work on the stone wall at Fort Pond Beach. Maybe we should reinstitute that, a little work session. And then they built a sandbank against the wall and covered it with brush, periodically tried to maintain that to hold back the ocean. And this is late 19th century Coast Survey's first house, and this is the wall right here in front of it. And not only that, but we have a painting of it. Terry Wallace found this painting. It was labeled Sand Dunes Montauk by the New York artist William Sartain. And this, you're on the land side. So undoubtedly the artist stayed at second house and went down there to the beach and painted this. So you're on the land side and there's the ocean between that little fallen down section of the wall. Only image we have really of any of the stone walls at Montauk, except for one photograph you'll see a little bit later. So this painting was gifted to the village's new Gardner Mill Cottage Museum by Alec and Hilaria Baldwin, and you'll be able to see it there in a few months. So on to Third House. This is Third House today at Montauk County Park. And Third House in the 1870s. This was the last, built in 1806 for the cattle herdsmen. It's bigger than the other houses, probably because there were more cowboys staying there for the cattle drives, and then periodically, or quite often, they moved cattle herds from one field to another as they were managing the field, so there had to be a lot more personnel out there at Third House. And here's Third House with its large barn, its livestock shelter, and some stacks of hay. And the keepers managed their own farms and took advantage of the rights to pasture sheep and cattle provided to them by the trustees. The agricultural census of 1880 indicates that Samuel Stratton, who was the keeper at Third House when this picture was taken, owned 4 horses, 8 milk cows, 17 cattle, 42 sheep, 6 pigs, and 150 poultry. He had a large fenced field with a median field for raising crops and other land for hay. So Stratton, just like all other farmers in East Hampton proper or Amagansett, could provide for his family and livestock through the winter. And of course, he also needed to provide meals for all the people that came and stayed there at Third House. So now take a look at the division of the pasture land for the cattle and horses east of Fort Pond. And it was divided into different fields by various barriers, fences, walls, and ditches, so that they could manage the fields and move the cattle from one to another. In other words, let the grass in one field develop before they move the cattle into it. So we have on this, here's Fort Pond, Great Pond, now Lake Montauk. This dotted line right here represents the stone wall that ran from Fort Pond to Stepping Stones at Great Pond. And this separated off what was known as the North Neck, all of this area. Great Pond, there would have been a fence going from Great Pond into the Sound. And on the south, there was a combination stream ditch that went down to Ditch Plain. And that's actually, you can see the whole thing on this map. It goes down here, goes around here, and it comes out at Ditch Plain. And that separated what was called the outside pasture right here from Point Field, which went over here. And then there was another fence from about here in Great Pond to Lake Montauk going out around Oyster Pond to the Sound, and that separated Indian Field from Point Field. In this 1904 Olmsted photograph looking across Fort Pond, you can see the stone wall running from Fort Pond to Lake Montauk. Or at least I can see it.
Very good.
But there it is, sneaking along. So it isn't much, but it's the only photograph we have. So it was pretty exciting when I enlarged this photograph on the computer, and lo and behold, there it was. This this fence with stone walls built in the 1820s, replacing an earlier fence. It was specified to be 3 feet wide at the base, 2 feet wide at a height of 4 feet, and then rounded off to 4 feet 6 inches. So it was quite a mile and a half long. So it was quite an undertaking. In the foreground, you can see this would be the field on Shepherd's Neck, the fenced field where the keeper at Second House raised his crops. And this was probably a haying field of him over here. This 1870 photo shows the cattle grazing in Point Field with a lighthouse in the background. There were 2 categories of grazing rights for cattle: the expensive fatting field rights and outside rights. For example, in 1820, 1 share allowed 56 common cattle on the outside pastures and only 12 cattle in the fatting field. The fatting fields were maintained to have the best quality grass, were closed to grazing until conditions were optimal, and had fewer cattle per acre than the common pasture. Each year, 2 fields were selected for fatting fields. Indian Field was always a fatting field, and that's why Third House was built there. Each year, either North Neck or Point Field was selected as the second fatting field. Cattle to be finished and slaughtered for beef were put in one field in August and in the other in September. The common stock remained on the outside pastures, which were along the ocean shore, west of Ditch, Plain, and then either North Neck or Point Field, whichever one was not a fatting field that year. And the keeper at Third House kept the field list. This is the one for 1821, and the page inside is the same as the common pasture list, and there's John Line Garden at the top. So to get a sense of proportion, I think he has 18 cattle in the fatting field, and he had 86 in the common pasture. So there were far fewer special, they call them the fat cattle, in these best pastures. So here's this great photo of Indian Field again. This was the prime pasture, closed off to grazing until August or September. And pasture was rejuvenated periodically by burning the grass. And keepers also removed unwanted vegetation. In September 1857, the trustees directed Samuel Stratton, keeper of Third House, to cut up all the Canada thistles east of Fort Pond so as, if possible, to kill them all. In addition to improving the pastures, the trustees and keepers also improved the quality of the animals through breeding. The keepers selected the best rams and bulls for breeding, and one year the trustees paid Samuel Buell Gardner to sail his prize bull from Gardner's Island over to Montauk. And this is Indian Field looking south toward the Montauk Association, which you see the cottages there on the horizon, Lake Montauk. The use of Indian Field was negotiated each year with the Montaukett Indians, and within Indian Field were the homes and farms of the Montaukett, and their farms were undoubtedly closed, fenced off to the cattle. The lives of the Montaukett at Indian Field and the relocation of the Fowler and Farrell families to Freetown in 1885 is another story that I'll leave to those who have thoroughly studied that history. This appears to be Ditch Plain looking northeasterly, with Lake Montauk on the left and Prospect Hill on the horizon. And there are actually some cattle here in this field in the 1880s. So I'm going to show you all of these pasture pictures because they're just so incredible. Another view with gently rolling grassy hills in the foreground, cattle grazing on the plain south of Lake Montauk, and the hills of Indian Field in the horizon. And it's hard to see, but there's cattle right here. And this watercolor, complete with the cattle in the rolling hills of Point Field, was painted by Isaac McComb upon completion of the lighthouse in November 1796. Isaac's brother, John McComb, who built the lighthouse, sent this to the Treasury Department, along with his bill for final payment. And then 100 years later, Thomas Moran paints this view of Point Field with cattle at Money Pond. And you can see cattle lolling about on the hillsides, and there's some cattle up here on top of this hill. This is a William Wallace took a photograph looking down Fort Pond from Fort Hill to introduce the other theme of Montauk during this period. The pastoral landscape maintained for livestock also attracted tourists and sportsmen who traveled to Montauk for hunting, fishing, berry picking, bathing, and sightseeing. The visitors boarded at the keepers' houses and also at the lighthouse. And a number of guest registers from second house and third house survive, filled with poetry and prose of the joys of visiting Montauk. This entry of September 2, 1874 is in the register of third house, kept at the time by Samuel Stratton. Reader, wouldst thou know what peace and quiet mean? Wouldst thou find a refuge from the noises and clamors of the multitude? Wouldst thou enjoy sun, sky, and breeze, green fields, the delicate juices of meats and fishes, good shooting, good fishing? Come to Montauk and stay at Stratton's. This is third house in the 1870s. Samuel Stratton, the keeper, is on horseback. The guests are playing croquet on the hillside. They all have croquet mallets, and you can see a wicket right here. And this young man over here has got, you can see his rifle or his gun is over his shoulder. He's carrying a duck. It's hard for you to see, I guess there's a little trusty dog. So gunning was certainly a big item of tourism in Montauk at that time. And here's third house with the Benson addition. We'll get later with the purchase by Arthur Benson of all of Montauk in 1879, but shortly after he purchased, he remodeled third house with the addition of this wing and the porch, expanded the kitchen and dining room. And you can see the guests enjoying the new porch. A visitor of 1883 gave the new hotel a good review in the Sag Harbor Corrector. Stratton's is a great, roomy farmhouse. Its original proportions considerably increased by a large L, added for the accommodation of summer boarders. The view from its open porch is simply superb. Traveled men say unequaled in novelty and attractiveness to anything in the old world. The gaunt, weather-beaten old house is set on the summit of a hill, which slopes gently down on the south and west to a wide plain, itself enclosed on two sides by green hills, and on the remaining ones by water, on the south by the ocean, and on the north by Great Pond. Over this pond one sees a shining segment of the Sound flooded with sails. Over the tumbled mass of hills on the east rises the white tower of Montauk Light. And there's no doubt that in 1883 you could see all of that from third house. Along with sportsmen came artists who often left sketches in the guest books. On June 6, 1881, John Ward Stimson drew this Montauk cowboy on horseback with his herding whip and entitled it Stepping Out After the Drove. And this sketch by Stimson is entitled Sheep Shearing, and the man on the grindstone is testing the sharpness of the shears on his thumb while another looks on with his herding whip. Benson remodeled second house in the same manner, adding a wing and a porch and enlarging the kitchen and dining room. And again, we have in 1880s the guests sitting on the porch. George Osborne was keeper at second house from 1866 to 1886, and the guest registers kept by Florence Osborne document the innkeeping that was a major part of life at second house. Guests arrived by carriage from Sag Harbor or by yacht, anchoring in Fort Pond Bay and walking down the roadway we saw in the previous photo. The guest books record visitors from South Fork villages, as well as from New York, Brooklyn, Hartford, New Haven, Norwalk, Newport, Westerly, Philadelphia, Lancaster, Washington, D.C., and Grand Rapids. Following are two samples of entries in the registers. In September 1867, a party of 8 from Westerly, Rhode Island, arrived on the yacht Triumph and after an afternoon of shooting, came in to supper, all in tip-top order, broiled bluefish smoking hot. In August 1868, Abner and Nancy Sperry took the steamer Sunshine from Hartford to Sag Harbor, and then continued by carriage. 3 hours on the road from East Hampton, arrived at 11:30, found a catted calf and waiting for dinner, and after had a good bath in the sea. After partaking of one of Mrs. Osborne's best suppers, retired for the night in the northwest chamber. And on these pages of Second House, we have the whole story of a little sporting excursion of 1866. These party of four arrived by yacht at Fort Pond Bay. You can see the sails there, the gaff sloop. There's the little tender that they rowed to shore in. They've got their supplies and their whiskey bottles. And here they are, a hunter on each hill with this little bird. And he is fishing. And I guess they're going home over here. Unfortunately, you can't read the text. I'm sure they're very interested. Beginning in 1873, businessmen from New York began to purchase shares from Montauk proprietors and applied to the courts for an order of partition, resulting in the sale of all of Montauk to Arthur Benson in 1879. Here's Arthur Benson fishing on Great Pond. He became wealthy in the shipping industry and retired in 1849 at the age of 37. To the good fortune of East Hampton's farmers, Benson was an avid sportsman who loved Montauk just the way it was. Benson also took on the role of gentleman farmer, bringing 2,000 sheep out to Montauk. Surprisingly, his purchase brought almost no change to the operation of the Montauk pastures. The same group of men who had been the Montauk trustees now leased pasture rights from Benson. The East Hampton sheep joined Benson's flock on Hither Plain, the herds of cattle returned to the fields east of Fort Pond, and the three keepers continued in their traditional roles. Benson's enjoyment of Montauk is evident in his 1889 obituary. Mr. Benson lived the life of a recluse when he retired to his cottage at Montauk. He was an enthusiastic fisherman and used to spend nearly all his days on the water. He was in the habit of rising early and eating a simple breakfast. Then he would go off in a boat by himself and not be seen until evening. He kept an iron pot in the woods in which he used to cook lobsters for his dinner. In 1880, Benson and his sporting friends formed the Montauk Association, where he and seven others built their cottages and a clubhouse. In this photo, we see Arthur Benson's photo, cottage, Dr. Agnew's cottage. This is the Hither Plain, or Ditch Plain Life-Saving Station. Each cottage was built on the summit of a point field hill. And the extent of it was they built their cottages, put in these dirt roads, and put a wire fence around it, and that was it. That was the extent of the development. Arthur Benson had refused to develop Montauk beyond the association, and he refused to sell any land to the Long Island Railroad. But after he died in 1899, his children, Mary Benson and Frank Sherman Benson, sold 5,000 acres from Fort Pond to Oyster Pond to Austin Corbin of the Long Island Railroad and Charles Pratt of Standard Oil. The Corbin and Pratt purchase is between the red lines here. And that included, of course, the two best pastures, North Neck and Indian Field. The Brooklyn Eagle reported the concern of East Hampton's farmers over the loss of these pastures. The purchase by Austin Corbin and C.M. Pratt of 5,000 acres of the Montauk lands at Fort Pond Bay has had the effect of very much disturbing the farmers of this town, who for more than 2 centuries have used the lands included in the sale as pasture land. And now they are in a quandary as to what they are to do with the herds that have been accustomed to graze there. The railroad people are reported to have decided that no cattle can remain on their land. This will be the last year that East Hampton will see cattle driven on Montauk. The beautiful grazing territory, which has been in use as such for nearly 2.5 centuries, will have to be relinquished. So this sale marked the end of the relationship between East Hampton's farmers and the Montauk pastures. And in closing, we take one more look at this beautiful lost landscape of the Montauk pastures. Thank you. That is the information. Does anyone have any questions? I'm happy to. Kurt?
Talk a little bit about the vegetation and what was natural then and today. How much was cleared? Was some of this naturally this way, or was it all?
The question of what this was when the cattle first came out here in 1660, I don't know the answer to that question. Larry Penny wrote a couple of articles in the Star about it, and he seemed to think that this was a natural grassland. And then how the succession happened to first shrubs and then trees, and didn't happen earlier, whether the Indians burned, maintained it by burning for their own purposes. But it is quite extraordinary that
I heard it was, I read, I think it might have been Larry King, that it was a prairie, and it was very similar to the vegetation at the Hempstead Prairie in Nassau.
yes, that's what, yeah, Larry Penny figures they're a natural
The prairie went
grassland.
from there to there, one time.
And
Where did the trees then come from? They just finally grew? or-
well, there were shrubs.
I mean, 'cause there's a lot of trees out there now.
Yeah, well, where the shrubs came first.
Right.
And as you can see in all these photographs, you see these little clumps of shrubbery.
Right.
Exactly what they are, I don't know, but they obviously would be expanding, and certainly in Hither Woods, which always was Hither Woods, in which a lot of timber was harvested from, that was woodland, and then the sheep pasture was expanded into it by clear cutting over centuries. So there's certainly that would come back to trees, and but when you see a landscape like this, it's incredible. I mean, if it were like that, that would be something.
Now, is that Fort Pond?
This right here, that's Oyster Pond.
I mean,
That's Oyster Pond.
that's
Yeah.
way east.
Yeah.
What happened to the cattle and sheep and horses when they drove them back to Amagansett? I mean, they didn't get on the train and go to the city,
When they drove them back to Amagansett, the farmers would have to come out and identify their cattle and take them back to their farm. This is pretty much how it worked. And the same for the sheep.
What's the circle of the ocean now?
That's the old photographs. It's something on a photograph.
It's a balloon.
Henry? Go, Henry.
For the few years I've been doing research on Montauk, and I guess it's reasonable to assume that the three houses were quite well known at that time. First, second, and third house?
We're quite well known to
Well, I
people
guess
locally, or
locally and to travelers, I guess.
well, certainly by the middle, after the Civil War, they were very well known. They were called by their people that stayed there. Osborne's second house would be called Osborne's.
Right.
That was the inn. Third house was called Stratton's. We have a ledger of kept by George Lester at Second House, who it said Montauk House on it. So they were. I mean, when people set out for Montauk, they knew where they were going to go.
Well, in conjunction with that, this is my question, and maybe you can give me your opinion on it. Subsequent publications and books and things have referred to First House as burning down in 1909. That story was never carried by any newspaper, and that always puzzled me. Do you have any idea why that would be? Not even the Star carried it.
I don't know. No, I don't know that.
It's a real mystery to me.
Maybe.
Okay.
I was going to ask, even with the earmarks what were a farmer's chances of actually getting his cattle and sheep back at the end, at the beginning of the winter? Because there were always so many lawsuits going on in those days, right? And so I just wondered how, with all those thousands of sheep and cattle.
Yeah, I guess some of them, they had to decide, well, this may be yours, this may be mine, right? I sent out 86, so I'm gonna get 86 back, but the calves would be distributed, that was so Stratton, where would keep a third house, he was in charge of distributing the calves. Because you don't know whose it is, so. That was his job, he said, this is you, you get this calf, so that was the one thing he did.
What is known about the Native Americans? How many were there? Are there any photos of those that remain? Were they still there when photos were taken? Is there
There's a couple
history of that?
There are. You may have noticed all the photos that have the gold oval. So those are all. There's one of the Montauk Lighthouse that is dated 1781, and those were by a Sag Harbor photographer, Isaac Van Scoy. He sold them there in Sag Harbor. So there's a photograph like that of about eight Montaukets in front of a fence in Indian Field. And the census records are probably the best for later on, for 1870 and 1880, they actually name the Montaukett living there. And in 1880 there are two families. So if you look at the census from Montauk, you've got the three keepers, the guys at the lighthouse, and then you have the two Montaukett families, which were Fowler and Farrow, and it names the people living there. Earlier there certainly were more, and one of the 1906 court case does describe that William Fowler had a considerable farm there with fields, and we do know one house which there's a photograph of it, which was moved from Indian Field to Freetown. So that was the King David Farrow's house. We do know it was a nice little cape. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about the history of the Montaukets being moved to Freetown in relationship to the pasture history?
Well, that's a subject that I'm not. That's a complicated story, and there were a lot of people involved in it. George Benson being one, no, George Benson, Arthur Benson. And a lot of the Montauk trustees who were still grazing cattle there. So it's that is a complicated subject, which there's quite a bit of documentation in the court cases. So that's a whole other story.
Is that a balloon out there?
We've decided that is a balloon. No, it's a.
Just an anomaly. It's a German dirigible. No, it's just a sunspot.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.